We are live.
All right, everyone. Welcome to another Wolfram Institute Community Forum. Well, I really enjoyed the community forum that we had last time. We discussed, in particular, future of
We are live.
science. All right,
Strategies
everyone. Welcome
for
to another Wolfram Institute Community Forum.
methodologies,
Well, I really enjoy scientific practices to expect in the future, things that we can develop, and also, I guess, something of a critique of existing uh, models of scientific institutions. Not really for the sake of critique, but we're a young organization. We have to make choices in how we uh, strategize and how we develop models to conduct science. And we should do it with some acute degree of foresight, where we have some thesis about where science is going, in what ways are our institutions underperforming, in what ways can we perform not only now, but as technological acceleration continues. So those were some interesting conversations we had last week, and we did not finish those conversations. We'll never finish those conversations. It's a pregnant topic, but I know that there's some other questions that Carlos has received, and Carlos is kind of the MC, master of ceremony for this. So,
Well, I mean,
Carlos,
the first.
go ahead, hit us with something.
No, so,
We're
so
ready.
the first point on the list was the follow-up from last week. I mean, we can jump to something else, but
I'd recommend we end with it just because we won't stop talking about that.
okay. So then I'll
Yeah.
I'll bookmark the other way. Yeah, perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, so Sid, who joined us last week,
Yeah.
he had a comment. So he says, I hope you can discuss and expand on the taxonomy of computation as you build the institute. I am particularly interested in recent developments in neuromorphic computers at Intel and also reservoir computation. Are you by any chance? I guess this is more a personal question to James, but yeah, that's it. Like the general interest is stops there. The other is you can check the comment on Discord. It's just a personal question for you.
Well, the short answer is reservoir computing, neuromorphic computing. These aren't styles of computing that we've even touched. I mean, that's the short answer, right? Are there forms of computing that we will touch? Well, yes. So this will be a facet of the work that we do. We're doing so much research from computational foundations. I mean, all of our research at the moment is either research about the foundations of computation or applying it to some particular area of pure science. But given that computation is kind of second nature to us, we'll also have projects that concern, say, computational technology. So we're making a foray, like as of this week, into distributed systems, for instance. Well, it's not quite this week. Nick and I are doing some work with Bob Metcalf on distributed systems, in particular, further developing the theory of Ethernet and this thing called backoff theory in distributed systems. And we're also applying for some other grants in distributed systems. That's one. We will make a foray into molecular machines and molecular computing. I also imagine that we're going to make an advancement into the development of theoretical cybersecurity, because cybersecurity itself is largely artisanal, and there's not that much dialogue between white hats and computer scientists, or at least there's not as much as there should be. We know some people who are interested in making that more theoretical, and I think that would be really quite rich to study. So yes, we're open in principle to studying not just computation as a technique or as a paradigm or as a suite of methods. We're also interested in computational technology. It just happens to be the case that we haven't considered the one, Sid, that you have in mind. Though, by the way, Sid, on a personal note, I received a request from you for a connection on LinkedIn, and I did send you a message on LinkedIn. So if you check your LinkedIn, I did send you a link, or sorry, a message like a few weeks ago. Anyway, if you're interested in seeing us, say, extend our research to these areas, and you're interested in partnerships, or you think that we could find funding for this kind of thing, or you have people who you have in mind who we could recruit, I mean, we're always happy to grow. And maybe there's something interesting to be done there. So anyway, I sent you a message on LinkedIn. We can continue that conversation there, Sid. So yeah, glad to hear from you.
Because I'm going to comment on what Sid is asking for, because we had earlier today in one of our meetings, and Nick and I were discussing how to implement all this hypergraph functionality and all the stuff that we're doing. And it's interesting that, I mean, we are constrained by the fact that we are primarily going to use Wolfram language. And I mean, Wolfram language is incredibly powerful, but at the same time, it has a computational sort of basis, right? Where you have your framework. I mean, to begin with, it's a digital programming language that can be run in the machines that we have. I mean, that's a choice, right? There's some perks that comes with it and some conditioning that comes with it. Because I find it very interesting, things like neuromorphic computers or more, call it molecular computing or maybe chemical computing, where you're, I mean, this was, I think, in a few meetings ago, we were talking about the fact that you can have things like reactions, chemical reactions as computations, right? And the basic sort of substrate for this at the coarse graining level that we study chemistry is not quite digital in the way that we typically encode it, right? We typically deal with it. It is chemical in some sense. It's kind of this aggregate reactants to aggregate results, right, or produce. So anyway, I mean, I think it's very interesting to consider if we are taking it only in the direction of, if we consider ourselves, looking at the foundations of computation in any serious forward-looking way, I think we should think regularly about, the very constraints that we're imposing ourselves by choosing.
Well, sure. Let's be realistic. I mean, Mathematica is very good for modeling. So if you take the work that we're doing on distributed computing, for instance, like we have potential partners who are using things like Rust or they're working with very low level hardware, but they have more theoretical questions that we can actually answer about, say, causality, for instance, and how that relates to what they're doing. Likewise, if we have a project in molecular computing, I mean, are we going to try and implement a full molecular computer, say, in Mathematica? No, there's no reason to do that. The goal is to engineer a different substrate for computing. So you can use, say, Mathematica for acquiring design sensibilities, for modeling certain things, for visualizations, for certain kinds of computation. Yes, we know this we know this in terms of limitations, especially when it comes to approaching computational technologies. We have partners who won't be using Wolfram language, they'll be using other technologies, but they still need help with questions that approach, say, foundations of science, where we're already quite versatile in dealing with those topics, especially using Mathematica.
Yeah, very interesting topics. Should we go to the next one?
Yeah.
Okay, this is a curveball, so it was about time that this happened. So Christoph says, I will go out on a limb here. I wonder if you have considered what one of the oldest intellectual traditions dedicated precisely to the understanding of the true nature of reality and the realization of that knowledge as a matter of first-person experience has to say about the nature of observers. I am, of course, talking about Buddhism. Contrary to the common belief, Buddhism is not a religion. I consider it a technology. The central teaching of Gautama, the Noble Eightfold Path, concerns discovering for yourself exactly what you are. A consciousness experiences the universe within itself rather than a being limited in space and time embedded in a world of objects. And so Christoph has a long post about this, and I think they are, give me a second. So they are essentially asking that observer theory is a central piece of the entire drama that he's explaining, connected to Buddhism and other intellectual traditions. And I think he's citing some more Christian tradition or whatever, but I think he's asking for the relevance of this and that context and for observer theory.
Well, maybe there are two things to be said. One is there is the need for a rigorous, in-depth philosophical investigation of some of the work that we're doing. We're going to be producing, for instance, a roadmap for the physics research that we're doing that includes, by necessity, a thoroughgoing, perhaps excruciating philosophical audit and inquiry into the exact claims that we're making, whether or not they're justified, what the implications are, how it relates to other canons and literatures in philosophy. And there's no reason why that canon should only be Kant, Heidegger, Deleuze, Spinoza, Nietzsche, Socrates, etc. I mean, there's no reason why that should be the case. And we have a philosopher, for instance, Hatem, who, in addition to being a physicist and a philosopher, is very well oriented with some areas of one theology, but also I would not be surprised at all if Hatem was also well versed in Buddhist philosophy, or as you want to call it, Buddhist technology. That's one comment. Another comment, which is more of a curveball. Hey, in response to a curveball, he sent another curveball. I did have this meeting last night with this research lab in Japan, and we were discussing, Mukash, you'll appreciate this. We're discussing I was asking them things that they're interested in. And they're interested in post-humanity, species hybridity, radical automation, this kind of thing. And I mentioned to them, in my encounters with people, I mean, I've been discussing post-humanity and custom speciation and this kind of thing in the medium to long-term future for a long time, and people in the U.S. really never think about that. And I asked the person, does the Japanese culture, philosophy, tradition, etc., better position people to think about these topics more frequently? I've heard, for instance, that in East Asia, cloning is much less of a taboo than it is here, because notions of originality and self and identity are different. So the idea of having a clone is not nearly as freaky as it is in the U.S. And the guy said yes, he felt as though Japanese culture, religious traditions, artistic traditions, etc., much better situated people towards I think a kind of an adaptive flexibility when it comes to some things that we'll see in the future. So what am I saying? Basically, what I'm implying is that I take philosophy seriously, relationship between philosophy and technology seriously, and I think that some dry restriction to Schopenhauer and Aristotle and this won't be adequate. I think that there are things that are missing that need to be incorporated. Though there is, I think, somewhat of a dearth in academia, for instance, in starting to establish these relations. There are only so many, good writers that I've seen who are translating between Japanese and German traditions in philosophy, or continental and Chinese traditions in philosophy. This stuff is really far from mainstream. You have to look for it. But some publishers who are interested in philosophy do engage with these topics. So I have an open mind, but we have to do it in a rigorous way.
So I guess as a direct reaction to this in chat, Chester, who I imagine is David, is asking, I'm curious what observer theory is. I guess he's asking for a succinct summary of, because the way at least I used observer theory in the reference of the comment was to the kind of questions that we are studying under this theme of trying to get observer-like properties out of these generative systems, or in general have this discrete causal set theory-like approaches. So I guess it would be good to have a sort of a succinct summary of what we're calling observer theory for people who are not up to date.
I'm not going to give a succinct definition of observer theory. Not to be rude towards David, but rather because there are a number of concepts, especially ones that say are coined by Stephen, like say multi-computation, the Rule-Yad observer theory, etc., where they're notions where, especially if you're working with Stephen often, they're circulated or communicated frequently, but Stephen usually does not pin down some particular definition of these things. What's the exact definition of multi-computation, or what's the exact, say, more mathematical definition of the Rule-Yad? These things are usually not offered, and it's not really Stephen's style. Now, Stephen's doing some research, with Nick and people, on observer theory, right now, this thing called observer theory. And so perhaps there'll be, I don't expect that there'll be some precise like one-liner definition, but it'll become more clear exactly what he has in mind. Now, with that being said, we can give some, I think, general motivation for observer theory, which is, I think in essence, let's say you have some emergent model where you're starting from some basic computational constructor. If it's accurate, not only should it produce the physical system, but it should explain why a physical system appears a certain way to an observer. Because, I mean, we ourselves as scientists are these computationally bound entities, and we happen to make certain observations, but it's in all likelihood somewhat of a partial picture. I personally do think that if eventually models are created that explain one, how you can construct from basic principles some underlying physical system, it also is able to account for the emergence of observers and is able to explain how observers capture information, to what degree they capture information, what observers are missing, what other information there is that observer could, potentially capture. For instance, if we create new technology and we have a kind of extended, phylum, or what's it called? Extended phenotype. Sorry, that we could capture more of this. I think that that's a very sensible thing to do. It's somewhat kind of non-anthropic or post-anthropic, but I think it's devilishly difficult to be able to. I mean, that's a devilishly difficult scientific question, which is what don't we know? Can we model? Can we prove, that there are aspects of this physical system to which we ourselves don't have access? What are the limitations of our own sensory faculties? Those are very difficult questions. If somehow we're able to transcend our own sensory faculties and understand, if someone advances some model and says that physics is like 10 times more complicated, and then there's all this phenomena, but we can't see it for whatever, computational reasons, those claims will be difficult to confirm because it's easy to say, there's some Lovecraftian, noumenal involvement, in the cosmos, but we can't access it. You can make that claim. It's difficult to. I'm not sure. I'm sure philosophically, if you thought about it carefully, you could figure out how to describe under what conditions those claims could be tested. But I think it's a bold, admirable thing to question. I think creating observer-dependent models of physics will be very hard. It'll take a long time.
Wait, but
Nick, what do you think?
I think definition of observer in general depends on the context. It's like what your observer, what kind of an observer you're trying to describe? Is it the one that measures quantum states in the quantum computational framework or whatever, foundational theory of quantum computation, or it's just a simple observer like us using some simple measurement device, just looking at a clock, and maybe some manometer or any kind of device like that. What does it mean to measure stuff in general? So it's like a very abstract measure theory that you can also call an observer theory, because if you want to define what measurement is, you have to involve a definition of an observer who is doing that measurement.
But not measure theory, not measure theory like
not the
Lebesgue
mathematical
and Haar and
not the mathematical measure theory, but measurement theory.
Measurement theory, yeah.
Yeah.
No, but I think that at some level the notion of observer is, I think what James is proposing is somehow, or what you were alluding to was this more sort of philosophical outlook, but I think in practice, we have examples of very successful observer-dependent theories that are, in my opinion, the most successful theories of all time, right? And relativity in its formulation, it is observer-dependent. Quantum mechanics is observer-dependent, but
Yes.
the model themselves, like the theory, the framework that the theory basically is, or what it sits, as Nick says, gives the context where those notions make sense. And I guess that's one of the great accomplishments of relativity theory. I mean, going all the way back to Galileo, or whatever proto relativity theories were, that they are giving a sort of a godlike view of what physics can be, right? Because they are not only describing physical phenomena as observed, but they are describing the process of observers observing physical phenomena, which is, I think, the kind of gold standard for today's physical theories. But sometimes it gets muddled in the kind of in the ontological and epistemological conversations that go around science. That's what modern physics has accomplished, because all the passes around, are there particles, are there strings, are there more species of particles, are there in this energy range, do you find these blips in your counters or whatever. Like, the conversation has gone into these more phenomenological directions, but I think one of the, and maybe David, if he's in chat, can also give his opinion, but I think one of the greatest accomplishments of modern physics is this systematic, mathematically rigorous approach to having theories about science itself, right? I mean, you're doing essentially a model of how observers observe phenomena and the phenomena itself, and they're kind of inseparable, at least in classical physics, in relativity theory, right? So I think in that sense, you can do an observer theory that's quite humble, because we already have several instances that work really well. But yeah, you can also go into this very weird philosophical angle where you yourself are always perceiving a theory, because you're a cognitive entity, cognitive agent, and you never know that if something is beyond your band of perception, like how you're gonna ever get access to it. These kinds of questions. I find that those questions a bit less interesting, because if there really can't be any interaction empirically, then might as well not exist. So, and I know that pisses off a lot of philosophers, but I just live happily without considering ontology like in my breakfast every day. So
I eat ontology for breakfast. Yeah, right. I think that basically the argument that I'm making is it's a matter of constructivism. If you're constructing some physical system, but it's desolate and there are no observers in it, and you're not describing, how those observers emerge, what their observations are, how much of the underlying physical system they're capturing, then I think in some sense, in terms of the prospect of constructivist physics, it's not fully constructivist. You can take one step farther, but it could be even the case, I'll make the provocation, that one would need to step outside of science, or at least scientific traditions that exist currently, in order to really be able to take some view that is external to the human physical observer and the observations that those humans do make. So challenges in constructivist physics, I think, are very great. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. Sorry, I'm a little subdued today. I ended up not sleeping very well, so go figure.
Okay, let's move on to the next one then. So Cliffy-Tosp says that they're curious about the role of the arrow of time. So they're asking, is the arrow of time significant in your models? How should I think about the rate of events and threats in a multi-computational setting?
Nick, do you want to take a stab at this one?
No. It's very similar to Everettian interpretation. If you want to consider how time works in the multi-computational setting, if you understand, or you already believe in what would be a single-way version of time, is just the equivalent computational time, right? It's just events followed by another event which are causally affecting each other. If you have a multi-computational version of that, when events are now somehow branch or don't commute, so that you can inevitably have multiple versions of the same sequence of events, right? Then you have to fork your process. Like it's a very computer science term. You have to fork it in order to and create a new universe. So it's like a separate hour of time that you create.
I'll say two things. One is in terms of the arrow of time in the statistical mechanical context. I should point out Stephen did release something on uh, the second law of thermodynamics, which I imagine does address the arrow of time. That piece came out like just a few days ago. So if you're interested in specifically thermodynamics, you could give that a glance. I'll say something else though about time. I posted this in the Discord maybe a week ago. One concern that I have is that, let's go back to this question of emergence. My concern is that if there is such a thing as emergent time, that a computational model will fail to explain emergent time. This is one of my provocations, one of my challenges. You see, originally, in terms of the physics modeling, the idea was that space and time, which are normally given together as space-time, could actually be disaggregated and treated separately from one another.
Well,
With space being something,
a different notion of time, right? There's a time perceived by an observer, again, embedded within a system, within a universe, and computational time. Those are, so you can say that observer time is emergent, but computational time is given to you by some concept that no longer more fine-grained, don't have any further fine-grained structure to it.
yeah, you see, I don't disagree with Nick there, but there's something about that makes me uneasy. I mean, the argument that I was going to make is that if time or even pre-observer time is essentially just the running of computations, I mean, these are computations that we are running as scientists in time. Like we're making these models and we depend on time in order to run these computations. And so to then have some system that we're computing and saying, well, time or even pre-observer time, time is being treated computationally, that it seems to me as though computation is not explaining time. It requires time in order to actually execute.
It's not really time. Maybe if you would call it something different, it's like if you do it using like some version of a bulk universe theory, right? You just given a roulette and that's it. You have all the computations that are possible from any state to other state with any rule, any computation. You just given it as a bulk, and there is no time. It's like because you can traverse it go from one state to another, but you're not really going because you're just given this traversal as it is.
So, I mean, the claim there is you have this graph, and the graph has paths. In order for the roulette to be constructivist, for instance, in order to know that there's that graph, you'd have to compute it. But in some way, we're making this philosophical argument. Well, what if we presume that it's already there, and we're not even constructing it? We're kind of just committing a priori to it as this kind of Platonic thing, and then time is this kind of emergent observation where there's this roulette object, and when you're kind of experiencing time, you're just kind of walking along this thing that's basically pre-given. I mean, it's not at all. I mean, I think that kind of emergent arguments are quite easy when you have some like Platonic a priori object, right? It's like, how does this thing emerge? Well, it was already there, and then you're just discovering it. It's like a very easy, argument to make. I mean, I think it's a borderline theological argument, right? What's the emergence of democracy? Well, democracy is already, the system that exists in heaven, and then our, democratization is just sampling this thing that already exists in the heavens. I mean, the idea of sampling a priori Platonic objects qua theories of emergence seems to me very convenient because we kind of think of the objects in advance, and then we just say they're already there, and then we say that we're sampling them. There's something about it that seems to betray the actual notion of emergence, which is you start with something that's not already there. I mean, part of the idea of emergence is the algorithmic complexity is supposed to be low. You have some theory where you're starting with some infinite object, then you're sampling it. Well, whatever that setup is, that's like an unreasonably algorithmically complex, starting condition, because your starting condition is this infinite object that's already there. Scientifically, that's not at all parsimonious. So that concerns me. I think this notion of emergent time is really quite difficult. I mean, naturally, we've heard, for instance, um, probably heard physicists in the past discuss like, examples like the Big Bang, or people say, there are certain physical, certain regimes under which our notions of time start to kind of break down. We don't really have that in these discrete computational models. Time never really breaks down. There's always some path. Even if you say have some hypergraph or something and you're computing it at like 5 steps, you have like 5 clean steps. And if you say that this is like the Big Bang, it's like time is very cleanly proceeding, even even in a way that's approximate to the Big Bang. So that's a concern of mine, and it's not obvious to me that at least given existing computational methods can address the question of emergent time. Now, it could be the case that higher forms of computation, et cetera, techniques that involve bulk theory or category or something could introduce a more abstract context in which time could emerge or even computation could emerge. That's the problem. If you treat time as computation, if you're going to discuss emergent time, you have to discuss kind of like where computation comes from. And if our models are computational, they're not explaining themselves. We can't explain, if this is another concern of mine. If computation is like this pre-physical medium where you have these underlying computational processes and we're ontologically committing to them, and then physical phenomena result from those, it's like, well, that's just like another turtle in our tower. So now we're saying, yes, the physical phenomena arise from underlying computation. But where does the underlying computation come from? And you can say it's fundamental, it's foundational, but that's just basically putting a dignified hat on the lowest turtle and saying this lowest turtle is special.
Yeah, I agree, but what else can you do? It's like the whole question is unscientific. You either have this dignified turtle, or you're just never comfortable with your answer, or anyone answer.
Self-referentiality. Right.
This is Wukash. Yeah, I like Wukash's challenge actually. Wukash's challenge is basically you either have an infinite tower of turtles or you have some loop, some self-referential loop.
If you have a loop, you can actually have a closed system. So
Right.
that's at least some gain. People don't like loops, but
Well, it's something that, as far as I'm aware, has never really come up in our discussions of physical models from computational foundation. By the way, this is in part why I feel as though this painstaking philosophical audit will really be important in the roadmap for the physics research that we do, because to Nick's point, there's nothing embarrassing about claiming this scientific exercise has explanatory boundaries. It can't defend this claim, it can't defend this claim, it can't explain this, it can't explain that, because in order to do so, it would have to begin to achieve explanatory power over its dependencies. And this theory framework is going to have dependencies, like it depends on computation, and at the moment it depends on computation being done in time. There's nothing humiliating about that, but it should be acknowledged. I don't really want to do research where there's this kind of vague, seemingly endless explanatory power that we ascribe to the work that we do. I'd like to very cleanly establish these are things that we can work on. These are questions we can answer. These are foundational dilemmas that we can attend to. Here are ones that we can't, and we can't for these reasons. If someone can invent something further that eliminates some of these dependencies or dissolves them in some way that makes it so that we can then explain ever more foundational questions, that'll be beautiful. That'll be progress. Progress at the bottom, not at the top. But I think progress at the bottom is important too. Richard, I'm curious what your thoughts are about, these quite like philosophical or foundational issues.
Yeah, I was just about to write actually the question in the chat. Although I don't want to point to Platonism, but the question is like, what is a computer in the Platonic realm? What would that be? What clock rate does it run at? Does it make sense to even talk about it? Or
Right.
is Platonism in that sense just kind of, hand waving and a useless discussion? And actually, I did find some, but don't look into it. Don't look into the content because it's a bit. A video came up in my recommendations, and it was something about like transcendental computation. I was like, oh, that sounds interesting. Platonic computation, that sounds interesting. And the guy makes some very interesting points, and he has some publications. But then you'll find videos where he's saying that, oh, in China they have these centers where they teach kids ESP and they can download things into their phone, and then you're like, okay, we're in quackery territory here. We're in pseudoscience territory here, and it was kind of disappointing because I was like, oh, we're off to a good start here. We actually was kind of discussing some kind of interesting points. Yeah, because as you say, we have to really define like, what is doing the work. Is there some kind of like frictionless computational substrate that is sort of underlying everything? What is that made of? What does it even make sense to talk about foundations, or is that some kind of is that a very human-centric way of looking at things? Are we sort of limited by our own psychology in our quest to find answers? I think in some sense we are. Like earlier, there were questions about Buddhism and so forth, and I think it's great to look at other pre-existing work, but at the same time, sometimes to go it alone means you're not, for example, comedians will not look at other comedians' work so that they are original. That's like just one example off of the top of my head. And I think within sort of philosophy, it's also, a lot of us spend a lot of our time thinking about things from our own perspectives, and I think we can make a lot of headway sort of independently. I'm often sort of thinking like, what can be defined sort of in and of itself. What we're dealing with is very relational. And so that means that there really isn't anything that one can grasp that can be defined kind of in and of itself without reference to anything else. And I think that is an interesting limitation and you kind of have to accept that. And from our perspective here, yeah. Anyway, enough of my rambling.
That's why I like the direction in which Carlos's research is going. Because instead of trying to strike bedrock beneath axiomatic systems, and instead kind of evaporated Boolean logic, Boolean algebra into this category of emulation passing between formal systems. And that to me, finding generality in which you can discuss like these passings between systems rather than presuming that there's some bedrock that you will strike, that to me seems like a more kind of a more enlightened direction to take.
Yeah, I mean,
which is what. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'm glad that you mentioned that because that came to mind as well. That I mean, I feel like in the recent advent of modern mathematics, category theory, these kinds of things in the second half of the 20th century and certainly the 21st century, I think that I think it's much harder to find mathematicians that are very passionately concerned with the foundations of mathematics in the sense of formalists. And it's much more common to find people who are concerned with the foundations of mathematics in the context of computation and science as a whole, right? Because I feel like if one of the key contributions of category theory as a mathematical theory, as an algebraic theory, has been the power of relation, right? The power of isomorphism, the power of when you can say, basically this idea of universality, right? Like an object is what it is towards everything else, right? It's in itself is basically nothing, but it is what it is with respect to everything else. And this is the central idea of category theory, I would say. That and maybe diagrammatic thinking is the two pillars of what makes category theory what it is. And I feel like it changes very dramatically the traditional narratives of what people have been bringing up. So I will just mention randomly that there was some discussion over Twitter yesterday about, there was some post about, the famous quote that if you don't get completely baffled about learning quantum mechanics, then you haven't understood it. These kinds of things, right? And there was some tweet going around to the effect of, we need to advertise quantum mechanics courses by saying that this is going to change your your worldview radically, and it's going to completely shift your paradigm. And then I myself and Jonathan replied saying, well, we don't identify with this because, you know, having learned classical mechanics and quantum mechanics kind of mathematically at the same level, and with this more categorical point of view, then you realize that what you're doing is really taking choices, and, you know, one is different from the other, but they are also very similar in many ways. And so basically we had a thread with some of the people in the same generation saying, we don't really feel like this, right? Like we don't feel like quantum mechanics is this incredibly perplexing theory that it was in the 20s when it was being developed, right? And that a lot of physicists have kind of claimed to be one of the main features of the theory. We have more of a, you know, okay, so this is a way that you interface with reality. We have had these different frameworks, and we had to come up with this very bizarre one if you look at it historically, but once you have it, it's just another one, right? Like, and so the question remains of how you develop these theories, and, you know, going back to observer theory, how you build these frameworks of physics and so on, but not so much about, you know, the things themselves. Because I mean, if you're prejudiced that physics need to look like balls hitting each other like billiards, then absolutely you're going to be mind blown all the time, because that's not how reality works. But if you don't have that prejudice at all, you're not saying, oh no, actually reality is fundamentally quantum. I don't find many colleagues that have said that as well, right? Like,
No.
you just have this much more relational kind of organic operationalist kind of approach to reality, which I think is in part due to computation. I mean, computation has made it much more obvious that that's a viable, and Stephen Ward, of course, in particular, is a viable view to have, right? So yeah, I think that's changing, and I think the Institute is very well positioned to be kind of a place where those questions are addressed in this more contemporary and forward-looking way. I mean, at the end of the day, we're all kind of networks and relational systems. I mean, that's how we've built this entire thing, from biology, brains, civilizations, computing, everything, right? The internet, whatever. So it's kind of natural at this point. You can't escape the pattern.
Yeah, in some sense, relations are fundamental, perhaps. But even Penrose has come out recently or for a while and speaking about the, you know, quantum physics and criticizing or saying that it's not correct. I just linked quantum theory cannot consistently describe the use of itself, and there's a few works similar in that vein that speak to its limitations. And Penrose also puts forward a kind of non-computational aspect to physical reality when it comes to objective reduction. And I haven't really heard much of a response to that within Wolfram physics, because I think it does sort of pose some interesting challenges. That if there are sort of non-computational processes which are resolving these space-time separations, then what does that mean? Or is he wrong, and maybe there's some other, you know, are we talking about sort of other computational classes, super Turing computation? Who knows? Like, what if you have,
Right.
you know, and what's the relation? Why do you
yeah.
have this? What is the relation? It's objective reduction. It's like orchestrated objective. His claim is that it's the time for self-collapse is the Planck's constant divided by the gravitational self-energy, or the degree of space-time separation for a mass in superposition. So the heavier, or the more massive a thing is, the quicker it is, going to undergo self-collapse without interacting with anything else. So yeah, space-time kind of, there's a discontinuity, and we can't really sort of account for that. And it poses real challenges for a computational view of the universe.
Wow. I mean, I'm aware of Penrose's work, I mean, because he's well known, but I myself have never read any of it, I must confess. But I think we brought this up during maybe the last live stream. You know, this notion, I don't know what to call it, kind of arithmetic chauvinism, this notion that all of physics will conveniently reside at the, you know, on the lowest rung of the arithmetic hierarchy. I think that's somewhat of a wish. You know, as soon as you're thinking formally, why we would presume that to be the case is not clear to me.
What do you mean by that, James? The arithmetic level?
Well, what if it's the case that in order to fully construct, say, all physical theories or the objects or the properties of them. What if, what if you can't do it with a Turing machine for some aspects? What if you need, say, hypercomputation, or there are some Turing jumps that you need to take? I mean, we know, that's why that arithmetic hierarchy exists, because these problems have been encountered in formal systems. Whether or not it applies to reality is not at all clear, especially when we deal with things that are, with questions of continuity, et cetera, et cetera. So I call it kind of arithmetic chauvinism, just as a provocation, this kind of idea that conveniently, all of physics will be Turing computable. Maybe we have time for one more, depending on what it is.
Yeah, I mean, we could, because I think we actually covered all of them that were from this week specifically. So maybe, do we want to end up with some thoughts on the follow-ups, or maybe we want to address, I mean, this is a completely change of gears, but Joel had posted a couple of weeks ago about the relation between mathematics and music. So maybe we can end on a lighter note, because that's much shorter and self-contained, well, relatively, to the larger topic of academic cultures and future of science and so on. Because I also had a note of, because there was some traction, some interactions about your participation in the Future of Science seminar, and these are things that were brought up. So maybe, I mean, it's your choice. I mean,
I'm not sure if I have anything brief to say about the relationship between math and music, especially music theory. One thing, maybe Łukasz will find this amusing. I mean, one thing that I know that, like, I've done in Mathematica before, is you can do things like listen to the zeta function, which I do find kind of amusing. And I have wondered, like, eventually, Łukasz, with Langlands, will there be ways to encode much of mathematics in a way that could actually be subject to to music making, or to that could be actually expressed in an audio way. So that would be kind of interesting.
Maybe. What is the specific question about music, or is just this?
Well, his comment is that, I mean, it's quite general, but he says, on the connection between maths and music in general, Euler wrote a treatise when he was 23, arguing how certain musical and harmonic forms map to the ability to appreciate higher math, and basically no one is doing anything with it other than a few hobbyists. So I think he was just commenting on the fact that mathematics and music had been kind of divorced, and I agree. But recently there has been, I replied to that actually by saying that recently there's been some progress in about, from the early 2000s, I would say, what's it called? Mathematical music theory, or I can't remember it exactly. There was a seminar that ran for some time, and there's been quite interesting progress. Like this idea of the tonants, where the Euler mapped essentially triad chords to specific topologies, and in particular there was this torus topology that was natural given the cyclicity of notes and so on. So this has been much expanded, and there's now like geometry. There's a book called Geometry of Music that actually has very precise and formal treatments of musical spaces and harmonic spaces and things like that. So there is, I mean, to Joel's point, there has been kind of a revival of maths and music going together. I would also like to comment on what you said of listening to the zeta function or whatever. I think that the oral medium is underused in general, because we use the visual medium to like check on the screen and read a text or whatever. But I think the oral medium is underused. I have been to a conference once, a physics conference a long time ago, where part of the data that was being shown was I think black hole mergings, and it was all audio, right? Like the data was audio, was purely audio.
Nice.
So I don't know. I feel like there's a realm of, I mean, going back to the topic of empirical bandwidth and so on. Like there's an entire realm of ways of interaction that we are not fully exploiting, and one of them is being more oral, and the fact that you can hear different pitches at the same time, and you can hear structure in pitch that is not kind of just aggregation, like visually, that is just a composition that is sort of aggregate, but it actually modifies the color, so to speak, right? It's almost like things affect each other's colors by being next to each other, right? Some kind of mixing, right? I mean, the color and music is a very, very, very strong metaphor, right? So I don't know. I feel like I had this thought experiment a year ago or so where you wanted to extend how we do measurement in the world. And I guess this is part of the question of what is computation fundamentally, which is this idea of, are you measuring, is it enough to measure something that is discrete and verifiable and comparable? If so, then there's no need to be symbolic or to be numerical. You can also be like chromatic, or you could be pitch based and these kinds of things, right? And in some sense, musical theories, musical systems, tuning systems and so on are a form of computation in some very precise sense, right? Not just as an analogy, but like in a very exact, precise sense, they are a form of computation, right? So anyway, those are my sort of 2 times in what Joel was
You also have algorithmic composition, which was
Sure.
used even before sort of electronic computation.
for
So
sure.
people were applying these techniques. On your points about hearing, the dynamic range of human hearing is really immense. Like I don't think there's anything, and similarly with vision, but visual domain being this 2-dimensional thing, and it's strange that the constraints of hearing being a sort of 1-dimensional signal, you would expect there to be less, but the brain seems to have devoted several techniques to sort of extracting as much information as it can. The hearing system is a thing of beauty in itself.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that the hearing is 1-dimensional. I would say that hearing is actually very high dimensional because it does a Fourier transform.
Absolutely. That's why I mentioned the hearing system.
Yeah.
You have the cochlea, etc. What I'm saying is that the modality, as it comes in, is a one-dimensional.
Sure.
We do all this work to extract through physical, mechanical, neural, and all the processing within the brain, and this leads on to other points I want to make. But before that, isomorphic keyboards. You should really watch somebody play an isomorphic keyboard. It's not a keyboard that's laid out linearly. It's in this hexagonal grid, and I played around with this idea. It's very cool because you now have a nice space that you're moving in, and when you watch somebody play, you actually start to sort of understand music in a very different way. It's really cool because when someone's playing on a 1-dimensional keyboard, a lot is obscured from you, and it looks like this dark art. But now when it's on an isomorphic keyboard, very complicated chords form much simpler patterns, and then the relationships between them are very beautiful. There's this nice kind of cubic-looking thing going on.
But anyway, you can actually achieve just intonation on isomorphic keyboard. So hexagonal isomorphic keyboard, you can do like exact just intonation. It just won't come back on itself, but like
right.
As you step.
And you can do that in a conventional keyboard as well. It's not. You can do that in a conventional keyboard as well. It's not a feature of the fact that it's.
But you can't have just intonation on conventional keyboard when you have the same chords and you can start from everywhere.
I see your point.
Yeah. I mean, if you have more keys, then you can. That's what the hexagonal keyboard does.
Yes.
Yeah, of course.
But the layout, I think, is interesting. It reveals hidden patterns that are normally hidden to us. But to speak to the neural thing again, because that's my background. I worked in machine learning applied to audio signals. And actually, one of the earliest sort of networks that I had produced was actually producing music by, what it would do is it would model the audio on the raw waveform levels. And it's a neural network that's kind of quantum in a sense that it looks at its past output. It has a hidden state that it's sort of maintaining and updating for every input. And the output is a probability distribution, which is sampled from to produce the next sample that gets fed back into the model. So you have models which learn on the symbolic level, which learn sort of MIDI, right? So there was a company I worked for that was doing that. So you took, massive libraries of MIDI data and try and learn sort of sequence models over that. But what's interesting now is that what's emerging is models that can sort of spit out sound, give it, and even now you can type in some text and get an image. There are companies now looking at, you type some text and this network will produce some audio for you. And obviously it's leveraging human creativity, right? It's not like because they're trained on things that we have generated. And I don't think there's any substitute for, human emotion or common sense reasoning or the zeitgeist, things that we just can't really sort of bottle up in a computational way. But yeah, there are some really interesting. You wouldn't have expected these networks to be able to model these long-range dependencies in a raw signal, because music is what, if you want to listen to a decent quality, is about 44.1 thousand samples per second, and from all that information, now you have to sort of you have to model the conditional dependencies among these samples and learn higher order, things from the raw audio level all the way up to the higher order sort of musical structures. But I think that whole discipline it gave me a very interesting perspective on music as a sort of data modality and as a generative process as well.
I've said this before, with time, again, as the Institute grows, there's no reason why we couldn't have fellows working on music theory, on, these topics that Richard was raising. There's no reason at all why we can't do that. Anyway, perhaps Carlos, Richard, maybe send Joel some links to some of these things that you've discussed, because I know that he takes interest in this stuff, and if he sends him links, I'm sure
I have already, but yeah.
Oh,
I've
great.
shared some. I
Okay.
shared some in the chat here, and I'll post them in the Discord as well.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
Cool.
All right. Well, unfortunately, I have another meeting that I have to do before I go to some event. So we probably have to cap this. We didn't get to discuss future trends in science, but
Next
heck,
week.
we had a number of questions to answer. That's something of a good problem to have. We can always, return to that next week. So yeah, thanks guys. Thank you to our viewers, for those on Discord who have asked these questions. We really appreciate it. And we'll see you all next week.
Yeah.
And if you guys don't mind, I just want to I want to discuss something quickly after we end the stream, if you
Sure.
don't mind.
All right, everyone. Thanks for watching. See you soon.